Morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Yesterday we had a very rich and remarkable day in which, among other things, we really benefited from the light of stellar presentations and were able to do so many things that I won't summarize now, just welcoming us to a new day of outstanding speakers, about which we're very excited. We've been planning this for a year, and we were so thrilled to have the participation of those who came from very far away and from very near in our hearts also, to share with us their thinking, the complexity of their mappings, their reserves, their enthusiasms, and all sorts of subterranean pathways and passwords to the oeuvre and person of Friedrich Kittler. We also considered very strongly the aporias of acts or passivities of commemoration and what that might mean. So welcome. Let us remember that we are here. And today we begin with a really remarkable group of thinkers and writers and people who have, for the most part, already graced us with presenting some of their work. We're very excited about this, and the person who will be moderating is in himself quite an expert on the work of Friedrich Kittler. So we're very, very glad that Mert Riesoglu is with us and can give some framing and some solidity to the very nebulous and difficult act of moderating, if moderation is the word for Friedrich Kittler. So thank you very much, and let's let the games begin.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So, our third session today in our colloquium, we have three speakers. So our first speaker is Professor Geoffrey Winthrop-Young, and from the University of British Columbia. He's also the author of the first book-length introduction to Kittler's work, Kittler and the Media, published in Polity Press in 2011, and also Friedrich Kittler zur Einführung in 2005. He has also edited the special annual review on Kittler in Theory, Culture, and Society in 2006, and also the special section on Kittler in Cultural Politics in 2012. So the title of his talk for today is What Was Kittler's Media Theory? So please join me in welcoming Professor Winthrop-Young.
Good morning. I first of all would like to thank Avital and Arne for the invitation. I would like to thank everybody who've given us such a great welcome and for all the support we've gotten here. I come from the other side of the 49th parallel, which in our discipline is quite a boundary still, so I'm very flattered to be here in such illustrious company. And above all, I'm very grateful because this colloquium has given me the opportunity to reconnect with acquaintances and good friends I haven't seen for well over a decade, and for that I'm extremely grateful. The only thing you're going to learn from this lecture is what I've learned, that life is much too short for such long separations. What I will be doing is I'm going to make a couple of remarks prior to my lecture, which are all designed to deflate any expectations that may have arisen prompted by my title. Number one, I will not answer the question posed, especially after yesterday, especially after the presentations by Rüdiger and by Chadwick. You all know the question cannot be answered because we're dealing with a boundary blurring autocatalytic loop which cannot be defined. And so it is hopeless to come up with an answer to my question, and I do what we always do when the situation is hopeless. We quote Luhmann. Man kann nicht abschließen, man kann nur anschließen. Translated into English with help from Ian Foster, you cannot conclude, you can only connect. Now, when I speak of Kittler's media theoretical production, I want to emphasize that I'm speaking of him both as the subject and the object of the media theoretical production. I'm interested in addressing the undergrowth from which his theory grows and the receptive overgrowth that has now accumulated on his theory. This implies, my next point, that I will be very consciously speaking as a non-German foreign observer of what non-German foreign observers have first called German media theory, which of course is an observer construct. And this discussion of this conserver construct has given rise to a couple of misunderstandings, even personal friction over the last couple of years, which I will be addressing simply because Kittler is front and center of the friction, as usual. Fourth, I will be also speaking about the undergrowth, and I will already confess that a certain moment of nostalgia is going to creep in. A nostalgia for that habitat where some of us first encountered and experienced Friedrich Kittler. And that is, of course, Freiburg im Breisgau, this scenic deposit of Philistine comfort discharged and clinging to the slopes of the Black Forest, famous for its Gothic cathedrals, its famous philosophers, and in my time, its no less famous police force. You may have noticed that my tone of voice with this lecture will probably be a bit more flippant. I have recently published in Cultural Politics an essay entitled "What Socks is Pynchon Wearing Today?", which details my personal experience with Friedrich Kittler, so I will not go into that, I will just be based on that. But in a nutshell, we had a good time. I had a fairly relaxed relationship with him, but I must say I realized very early on that, like all fireworks, he is best sampled at a certain distance. Now, we have a long and promising day ahead of us, and that is why I will keep it light. And one of the running gags, the monkey dancing along to my organ, will be the exposure of Kittler to a mythological habitat, which is very different from the Aphroditic, polymorph, priapic habitat of Greece he's normally associated with. I'm speaking of Old Norse mythology. I should point out that I am half Swedish. I am professionally entitled to talk about this. For several years, I've been teaching German media theory and Old Norse mythology, and I am tempted to do it at one and the same time to explore the obvious similarities. It would be very tempting to find out which Nordic god corresponds to which member of the medienwissenschaftliche pantheon. When I first encountered Kittler, I very soon came to think of him and to refer to him as the rogue god Loki. As you can see, the similarities are obvious. Like Kittler, Loki was a gleefully rambunctious, charismatically destructive, highly informed, tech-savvy trickster, a mixture of Mephistopheles, MacGyver, a bit of Machiavelli, and Monty Python. Now, the similarities are not only of character, but also of story. To understand the following, I would invite you to think of the German department in Freiburg, round about the late 70s and early 80s, as Asgard. The question why this particular German department came to be such a prominent beachhead in the German reception of French post-structuralism has been debated a long time. I will not address this, not only because there are people in this room who are more qualified to do it, because also in my experience this question needs a certain blood alcohol level, which most of you no longer or not yet have achieved at 9:30 in the morning. However, I think it is fair to say that the German department in Freiburg at the time was a kind of an instructive microcosm of the theory squabbles that were going on. Long before that which was later called the theory wars, with all its isms and ologies and post this and new that, impressionable young students first encountered these wars in the shape of professorial backstabbing. Chairholder X put down Professor Z, who in turn condemned Akademischer Oberrat B, who in turn said that Privatdozent Y was a reactionary doofus. And so it went on. And these were the stories I heard. Now, with regard to the emergence of the young Kittler and the post-structuralist rat pack, in which he was very much the Sinatra, the story I heard was the following. I was told, and this I heard behind closed doors or in the dungy darkness of some of Freiburg's less reputable establishments, that the young post-structuralists, and especially Kittler, had been bred and nurtured by the conservative forces in the German studies in order to be deployed against the left. Yet once they had been unleashed, this hatchet squad, like some bloodthirsty creature cooked up in a H.P. Lovecraft story, turned back against their own backers, because the very ideas that could be unleashed against left ideas of social progress or the rise of the middle class or the rise of the working class could just as well be used to attack the conservative, more hermeneutical tradition which had given rise to it. Kittler, I was told, was a kind of a Siegfried. He was hired for his big biceps, and then the Burgundians forgot to get rid of him in time. But I was reading Snorri Sturluson, and I remembered the story of Loki. The great god Odin, whom in your mind's eye you may equip with the facial features of Gerhard Kaiser, the great god Odin, caretaker of a troubled world, recruits the resourceful Loki to aid the besieged Aesir against the forces of evil, that is, the giants and frost giants. As recounted in old legends and modern movies, Loki breaks rank and then starts to bring down the establishment. That is the Kittler I first knew. Although that is my story, the story I heard, I'm quite certain that others heard more dramatic stories where Kittler was a kind of a Thor who wields his mighty hammer, forged, as you will record, by a diminutive figure residing in a dark forest, against the critical frost giants from Frankfurt. On a more serious note, there are similar epistemological quandaries. Almost all we know about the Christian gods of Asgard was recorded by biased Christian observers, as in Snorri's own tales, who has to go into big demonological and euhemerist narratives in order to talk about gods he cannot do without, yet which he cannot posit in their existence. But matters are more complex because the Christian snapshots are of a world which is already reacting to Christianity. And so you have in Luminese shorthand a mutual observer construct where it becomes very difficult to distinguish between the exclusions imposed by the observing Christian system and the exclusions generated by the observed pagan system. In much the same way, what we in the Anglosphere call German media theory is an observer construct. German media theory, the brand, the fad, the exportable label, is as German as French theory is French. And as in the case of French theory, they are obviously the recycling of hackneyed cliches. The raw materials were produced in the countries indicated by the adjectives, but their streamlining into a national coherent body of theory was for the most part performed abroad. When in October 2004, Gert Lovink, who is basically the Snorri Sturluson of German media theory, posted a mail in the email forum Rohrpost asking whether or not there was something called German media theory, he received answers that recalled old doctrines of the subjective idealism. He was said, if such a natural theory occurs at all, it is because it is being observed from the outside. That means there wasn't a German media theory until people in other countries spoke about it. Esse es percipi. In any case, in due course, this construct has been submitted or subjected to increasing restrictions. As you will recall, in 1999, New German Critic special on German media theory is very ecumenical and includes everything, whereas the 2007 Grey Room special restricts itself clearly and explicitly to that term of German media theory that is associated with the name Kittler. Now, to all my fellow Canadians, let me repeat that. I feel very lonely here. To all my fellow Canadians, you will realize that this observer construct recalls the selective branding of so-called Canadian media theory. In both cases, we are dealing with a set of controversial founding figures who scandalously observed media studies from the outside. In both cases, the origins can be linked to the specific dynamics of locales such as Freiburg and Toronto. In both cases, theory production is marked by the generous deployment of the term media, or in Innes's case, communication, which, however vague, is clearly designed against the Pavlovian association of media and mass media. In both cases, a familiarity with literary hermeneutical techniques was a significant part of the challenge of the media-indifferent channel theory of established communication and information theories. In both cases, the focus on hitherto neglected media-specific materialities stressed the categorical distinction between media and the fact that this difference was the prerequisite for understanding of media. In other words, in both cases, the new, soon-to-be brand-named intellectual products amounted to theories of contrastive intermediality aimed at disrupting the homogeneous narrative of continuity. In both cases, the emphasis on ruptures resulted in the deployment of a revolutionary rhetoric which, to conjure up Koselleck's distinction between meta-historical and trans-historical, made theorists like Kittler and McLuhan come up with a meta-historical concept of media revolutions, which they then try to tie back into trans-historical. And in both cases, this particular theory was widely denounced as techno-determinist, an objection that determines nothing else than the ignorance of those who raise it. But as in the case of the Christian observation of pagan religion that is always already co-opting Christian features, matters are more complex. It is no coincidence that invitations to outside observers to comment on the German media theoretical production followed in the wake of large-scale institutionalization in Germany of Medienwissenschaften, which of course is an institutional ritual which demands self-reflection. To invoke a venerable German formula, it is Selbstverstehen durch Fremdverstehen, to make sense of yourselves by trying to understand how others make sense of you. Of course, not everyone was happy. German colleagues, less enamored of Kittler's work, there are some, criticized the wholesale differentiation of media theory with Kittler. That I can fully understand. And in our defense, observers such as Gert Loving or John Peters or Jussi Parikka have always stressed that there is something beyond Kittler. What I cannot understand are colleagues who go into vigorous punditry saying that there is no such thing as an essential German media theory which is the emanation of the German soul. Of course not. But nobody was ever imbecilic enough to say that. Da muss ich ganz dumm fragen, für wie bescheuert halten die uns denn? Looking back at this look across, one of the sources of misunderstanding was the expectation that outside observers would furnish a measured, neutral account. We did not want to do this, and I do not even think we were able to do it. German contributors were dressed up or tuned down. We either gentled their condition or we removed the canine teeth that had been very prominent in German debates. Above all, many decisions, such as the narrow focus on the Kittler effect, were made in compliance with the dictates of connectivity. True to the basic tenets of information theory, connectivity rests on a viable mixture of redundancy and surprise. Ideally, matters must be both far out and familiar, as in the case of certain features of Derridean construction a la North America shows. Optical connectivity is achieved when you have something that will allow you to pursue new ends without having to sacrifice the old tools you acquired to reach it. Which brings me to another and somewhat less flattering Old Norse versus Christian parallel. Armed with exegetical expertise and a peculiar form of hermeneutic arrogance, Christian observers claim to understand the Old Norse habitat better than the Old Norse understood it themselves. So for all their deluded heathendom, pre-Christian religions were said to possess a marginal truth content because they contain prefigurations of Christian insights. So Norsemen telling tales about the god Balder had already hit upon ideas of resurrection and salvation. Something similar occurs in the construction of French or German media theory by North American observers, though it has less to do with self-serving teleological description than with the more simple idea of translated applicability. It is not the North American scholars claim to understand the Germans better than the Germans understand themselves. It is that some North American observers claim to think that what the Germans say actually fits much better into North America. Consider the hypertext hype of the early 1990s, when the new possibilities of digital text processing were celebrated by some North American scholars as the materialization, instantiation, indeed redemption, that's their word, not mine, or vindication of French post-structuralism. Much like an oversized airplane that has arrived years ahead of schedule and that now has to wait for the American ground crew to build a runway, French theory was caught in a holding pattern before it had a possibility for a touchdown in reality. But once American technologies are in place, theory itself becomes unnecessary, since, to quote one of the leading texts from the day, what is unnatural in print becomes natural in the electronic medium and will soon no longer need saying at all because it can be shown. Now, at times I sense a similar gesture in the appropriation of Kittler, whose media theory, whose oeuvre is very often associated with the oeuvre of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Mind you, not without a certain justification when it comes to attitude and atmosphere and to zeitgeist background. But please remember one thing, and that is that there is so too much Heidegger in Kittler to be Schwarzenegger. And that is that theories, phantasms, figurations of anthropophobia or of the technology taking over us are no less anthropocentric than theories of us mastering technology. This is a basic misunderstanding of what Kittler's trying to say. Now, to be sure, some of the hyped imports are complicit in the repatriation. Before he voiced decidedly less flattering assessments of US academia, Kittler was prone to portray America as a haven of technophilia, claiming that gramophone film typewriter would be better understood by Americans than by Germans. Edison is an important figure for American culture, like Goethe for German culture. But between Goethe and myself, there's Edison. Germans don't like to hear this, but naturally, Americans do. To all connoisseurs of Kittler Deutsch, Kittler German, remember the basic rule. The moment he uses adverbs or similar constructs which indicate that something is naturally, simply, or nothing but so, especially when he uses his favorite word, which contains his entire oeuvre in that word, selbstredend, translated as evident, literally self-speaking. The moment you come across a word like that, he is leading you into P.T. Barnum territory, so watch out. Now, let me return to a last, better, and more interesting Old Norse analogy. All the way from the Völuspá to Richard Wagner and to Scandinavian Viking metal bands, we encounter gods and worlds living on borrowed time. Norse religion, and this too is a form of kind of anticipatory effect of Christianization, offers a grand narrative mounted on an apocalyptically charged future tense. The bound Loki will break loose, the snake will rise, the earth will go down in a great fiery entropy. Now, the analogy in German media theory is a small but significant deployment of the past tense. One of the last lectures by Cornelia Fissmann was Was waren die Staatsmedien? What were state media? Based on a lecture of the same name, Klaus Pias edited an anthology, Was waren Medien, in which free papers his own, Was waren Medienwissenschaften, invoke the past tense. For those of us struggling to get media studies program going, it is very eerie to see a country in which there are so many where they are suddenly asking what they were. There are several reasons. The first, not that important but entertaining, is a kind of a post-coital tristesse, which is brought about by successful institutionalization, which is a form of administrative consummation, I guess. Like everything under the sun, German media theory follows the dictates of a French 19th century novel. First, the young hero arrives in Paris and takes on the world, and then they grow old and have nothing left to say because they become nostalgic. Kittler sadly noted before his death, and who could deny that similar hangover sentiments are with us observers, that the infatuation is over and that the moment has peaked and other things have become more interesting. But more to the point, and more importantly, the past tense confirms technological realities. The question, what were media, makes sense once the basic notion of distinct media in the plural becomes questionable. I'm sorry to subject you once more to this famous quote. Once formally distinct data flows are turned into standardized series of digitized numbers, any medium can be translated into any other. With numbers, everything goes. Modulation, transformation, synchronization, delay, storage, transportation, scrambling, scanning, mapping. A total media link on a digital base will erase the very concept of medium. Instead of wiring people and technologies, absolute knowledge will run as an endless loop. Famous ending of the introductory section of Gramophone Film Typewriter. This is Kittler's Prospero moment. Just as the great magician admits that his audience has been watching a baseless, insubstantial pageant, the great media theorist announces that there's no basis for any substantial distinction between media. And we know that this is just the beginning. Future generations will view the erasure of intermedial distinctions as a prelude to the erasure of the distinction between media and environment. As the always quotable William Gibson put it, it is doubtful whether our grandchildren will understand the distinction between that which is a computer and that which is not. To be clear on this, Kittler is not claiming that there are no media anymore. He is just saying that their demotion renders the term questionable, like impoverished aristocrats forced to work as tourist guides on their former estates. Media have been moved to the boundaries of the great computing machine, where they now function as subaltern interfaces between us and them. Their helpful sounds and pretty images are concessions to our digital processing speeds. The main difference between Prosper and Kittler, of course, is that Prosper had the decency to wait until Act 4 before he debunks his own show. Kittler, however, published his obituary of analog media in 1986. In terms of the history of technology, that is quite late. It is roughly 50 years since Alan Turing provided the blueprint for a machine that can simulate and hence marginalize all other machines, and roughly 40 years before Shockley and Shannon provided hardware and theory to it. However, once we consider the history of theory, Kittler's statement becomes interesting because the admission of a collapse of plural media into the universal Übermedium preceded the flowering of media theoretical production that so vigorously emphasizes media specificities and intermedial differences. The acknowledgement of a medium that terminates all media distinctions stood at the beginning of a theory onslaught that focused precisely on foregrounding said distinctions. From the very outset, then, there is a kind of a Wizard of Oz component at work in the Kittler effect. Much like the scary floating head that sends Judy and her entourage off to kill the Wicked Witch, the alpha term media is a formidable initiator of changes in the media land of Oz. At the same time, there is a whiff of humbug. But therein lay its strength, and this applies to German as well as to Canadian media theory. Thanks to its stealth-like strike capabilities, its mobile flexibility, and heavily armored vagueness, media, then an eager pirate concept, enjoyed a far more successful career than it would have done had it been more clearly defined from the outset. But much like the Old Norse gods, it was living on borrowed time. And here the doomed future tense corresponds to a small but significant set of counterintuitive negative assertions that grace the titles of German media theory. Kittler, there is no software. Bernhard Siegert, there are no mass media. Eva Horn, there are no media. Media and media theory, then, deserved the past tense, not only because they were a thing of the past, also because they never really were in the first place. In hindsight, Kittler's media theory was so good at revealing the blind spots of established social and critical theories of media, communication, and literature, because it was so good at obscuring its own blind spot. And this despite the fact that the latter had been revealed at the very outset. Kittler's theory is a bit like Shakespeare's Henry V. An initially media-savvy, highly self-conscious show that gets so carried away by its zest for battles that it forgets its own introduction. The high profile of media philosophy in Germany is frequently explained in terms of the equally conspicuous epistemological tradition in German theory. Certainly, attempts to reconstruct media as a form of idealism with a transcendental technological subject, or proposals to ponder media as self-concealing means of disclosure that unsettle the essence-appearance distinction, all these profit from accessing a very rich vein of thought leading from Leibniz and Kant all the way to constructivism. Media becomes an atlas concept, able to shoulder 300 or 3,000 years of phenomenological, epistemological, and critical inquiry. However, the emergence of media philosophy in Germany is also linked to the fertile vagueness of media, which invites a redefinition of the latter, less in terms of objects than with a view towards the underlying problematics of mediation. One noticeable German trend, and one worth observing, leads from media to mediality, a now fully developed pirate concept that ultimately needs no clearly circumscribed disciplinary location because its hosts are everywhere. In his famous essay on the modern travails of the work of art, Walter Benjamin noted that the mechanical reproducibility is directly preceded by increased exhibition value or exhibitability, Ausstellbarkeit. For instance, the globally consumable celluloid images of early Hollywood divas are a qualitative transformation and already contained in the equally ubiquitous world tours of Sarah Bernhardt. I would suggest that this technological transformation of mediation in turn contains the theoretical transformation of media. The mobile, strategically vague notion of media facilitates its reconceptualization as a discourse strategy, to quote Klaus Pias, akin to feminism or deconstruction. Rather than imposing itself from above as an overarching concern, the question of media emerges as a line of self-questioning from within each discipline. The ideal institutionalization of this new and improved media theory is not a discipline-specific department, but a faculty of its own, much like the faculties of education on certain North American campuses that happily reproduce the entire world and the entire campus within its own four walls. But to get to the core sample, and here I'm shamelessly plundering the forthcoming introductory chapter of Bernhard Siegert's collection on cultural techniques, one of the great misunderstandings in the reception of Kittler is to conceive of the reconfiguration he brought about in terms of a change of objects rather than in terms of a change of reference. In the first instance, media were not a new story, but a new way of telling an old story that highlighted the blind spots, the suppressions, the blind women in the attic, the mad women in the attic, and all the other troublesome image that the old stories elided. Kittler's media theory, then, is a counter-narrative. Addressing myself to Germanists here, Kittler's media theory is what Heinrich von Kleist's Hermannschlacht is to Friedrich Schiller's Wilhelm Tell. It tells a similar story. It, however, opens up the account on Schiller's play, showing what Schiller cannot and will not show on stage. What is the cost of your suggestion? Here, let's see what happens. This explains what is often overlooked in the media or technology-centered appropriations or amputations of Kittler. The very close proximity between Kittler's narratives to the more established doxa he is rebelling against. 1. The refunctionalization of religious discourse in 18th century German literature, a well-known critical tradition, that posits a guarantee of meaning through the continuity of creation, is substituted by the maternal mouth with its equally trustworthy guarantee that anything that is uttered is meaningful. 2. The well-known exclusion of women from public and material production is substituted by the exclusion of women from discursive production. And 3. Kittler's, what in a very highfalutin German term I would call Borussianismus, that is the idea that the glorification of the Prussian bureaucrats who were able to reboot Prussia after the Jena-Auerstedt catastrophe returns in his philosophical imperialism of the poet-bureaucrat. A closely related aspect is best illustrated with the obscure Nietzsche quote that Kittler made famous. Unser Schreibzeug arbeitet mit an unseren Gedanken. Working tools are also working on our thought. The great Harold Innis was not familiar with this quote, but at the risk of turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass, I think it is fair to say that he, Innis, literally worked himself to death over the implications of the obvious self-reflexive twist. Wenn unser Schreibzeug an unseren Gedanken mitarbeitet, dann arbeitet unser Schreibzeug auch mit an unseren Gedanken über unser Schreibzeug. If our writing tools are also working on our thoughts, then of course our writing tools are also working on our thoughts about our writing tools. Which opens up an infinite regression because it contains the self-recursive confusion of the means and ends of scholarship. Now, the question to what extent Kittler's move into the Greek domain is or is not a departure from media theory must be seen against two things which are difficult to bring together. The necessary self-dissolution of a counter-narrative, that precisely keeps in mind the self-recursive qualities I was talking about. Kittler is to me an evolutionary equivalent, an idiosyncratic variation of the extremely successful failure of German media theory. We are witnessing a rare instance of highly fertile self-dismantling that recalls equally rare acts of abdication in politics and religion. Here, finally, is the last Old Norse analogy. Legends and prophets tell of a world expiring in a final showdown of fire and ice, but reality was more prosaic. The old gods died of Habermas. They fell to pragmatic communicative reason. It was realpolitik rather than Ragnarök that killed them. Fearing the civil unrest that could arise from competing religions, Althing speaker Thorgir was charged with reaching a binding decision in 1000 AD which religion should prevail, that of the one or that of the many gods. Accounts, in particular the great account in Njal Saga, record that Thorgir withdrew into his booth, hid underneath a blanket, and re-emerged 24 hours later to pronounce that from now on Iceland should be Christian. I freely confess it's been very long since I attended a church service, but I do not remember clergymen behaving in such a way. Clearly, Thorgir was acting in ways more appropriate for contacting the old denizens of Asgard. And that is the point. The pro-Christian decision was arrived at in pre-Christian fashion, allowing followers of Odin to take solace in the belief that their god had given sanction to his own abdication. And why not? Unlike his Christian replacement, Odin never laid claims to omniscience. And unlike his Greek-Roman counterparts, he wasn't much of a skirt-chasing bon vivant. The world was too large and too complex, even for gods to understand, its fate too precarious and intriguing to waste immortality on endless carousing. His resignation would leave him free to wander the world with his staff and his long coat, with his one good eye, in pursuit of more knowledge and more understanding. And so he wanders still, with or without hat, through our fantasies and fictions, from Gandalf all the way to Wizard of Oz games. And here, likewise, German media theory, that section worthy of transatlantic observation, has abdicated, dissolving itself into constituent components that were already at work in its inception and that are now free to explore new terrains on their own. Kittler himself vanished into the Greek past to ponder the recursive connections between the siren sounds of Pink Floyd and the no less psychedelic numbers of Pythagoras. And of course, this domain is on a beautiful Colloquium poster. He, no doubt, would have enjoyed it. What would German media theory be, especially the Berlin model, without excursions to the Gulf of Salerno? There goes my invitation to Berlin. But I must admit, when I associate Kittler with liquid domains, I think of more modest bodies of water. I think, first of all, of course, of the river Dreisam. That orderly, not very adventurous, glorified brook that runs through Freiburg, still flustered that it passed underneath the feet of so many smart people, some present here today, some sadly forever absent. I apologize for Husserl. I couldn't get a picture where he doesn't look in a bad mood. And now you know why Bernhard is smirking. He's leaning on Heidegger. I think of the little canals running along the streets of Freiburg, but most of all, I think of the lakes and quarry ponds, the Baggerseen, that spotted the vicinity of Freiburg, the Opfinger and Flückiger and whatever they were called, and that now and then found their way into Kittler's tales of transgressions and intoxications past. whether these deterritorializations were pharmaceutical, hallucinogenic, sexual, or purely imaginary in nature, I do not know, and I do not care to know. What I do know is that they add to the baseline command of Kittler's media theoretical production, which, in the words of Emil Steiger, are quite simply zu begreifen, was uns ergreift, to come to grips with that which grips us. In a very famous German play that Kittler claimed to have interpreted so well that there was nothing left to say, neither by him nor by anybody else, one of the protagonists sends this famous message to his young protégé. Sagen Sie ihm, dass für die Träume seiner Jugend soll Achtung tragen, wenn Mann sein wird. Nicht öffnen soll dem tötenden Insekte gerühmter bessere Vernunft das Herz der zarten Götterblume. Dass nicht soll irre werden, wenn des Staubes Weisheit Begeisterung die Himmelstochter lästert. Admittedly, like many German hallmark quotes, this comes with a big lack of Voltaire, but I think we'll survive. I think that we should take it as a suggestion, an injunction to address to us that we should have respect for his dreams, now that he's no longer there himself. Though I must say that I really would emphasize the word Achtung, which now, more so than in Schiller's days, comes with the double meaning of caution and respect, esteem and prudence, admiration even, and wariness. There are many theorists who deserve one or the other. He is one of the very few interesting enough to deserve both. Thank you very much.
So you had mentioned the French-German connection and Kittler's youth, and what I was wondering is, so the way he was influenced by Foucault, I was thinking of how he doesn't talk about the present, how he so the present for him is something that his archaeology cannot penetrate into, whereas in the case of Kittler, he has a lot to say about this erasure of the intermedial differences. So I was wondering whether you see this as a kind of theoretical difference, as an influence that goes beyond Foucault, and what that implies for the project of archaeology.
There are not enough words, not even in the German language, to describe the relationship of Kittler to Foucault. It is grounding, continuation, critique, redemption. It is sublation. Very basically, the idea is not only that Foucault's methodology stops the moment the era of the book is over, and now you have to deal with other means. It is also already in Foucault's analysis, there is a lack of a consideration of the undergrowing technologies at work. So it is exactly, as I say, an updating, and it is a grounding within the eras that Foucault covered. With regard to the position in media archaeology, this is a very, very good but huge question. For one, I advise that you read, 900 pages by Knut Ebeling on media archaeology. That will answer the question. But the main idea seems to be the following, and that is no archaeology can proceed without the layer-by-layer analysis of the networks that allow for the validity of speaking and judgments in a given era. Point number one. Point number two, it becomes ever more important to see how these technologies contain their own time, so this can no longer be accessed by straightforward historical narratives. Number 3, more in line with Nietzsche than Foucault, precisely this analysis will allow you, A, recursive movements forwards and backwards, and 2, also to detect those hidden, I won't say origins, but points of departure and sparks which Foucault did not see. Remember the famous scene he talks about in his obituary on Foucault, the only time he ever saw Foucault in, of all places, Bayreuth, where, like Dante looking at Beatrice, I did not speak to him. I did not dare approach him.
I would like to ask about the relationship between Kittler and Willem Flusser, especially in this critique that already Willem Flusser makes towards the concept of media that was born in the early 80s. And at that time, Friedrich Kittler invited Willem Flusser to the famous seminars in Bochum.
Mm-hmm. Again, this would require a very long answer, and I can only give the very short one. And that is, they had very little to say to each other in terms of the very basic understandings of the relationship between humans and technology. That is the first big point where they differ, not in opposing each other, but in talking straight past each other. When you read Flusser, one of the big differences is that you have this pointillist theory, whereas with Kittler you have the obsessive unfolding of the big idea. So already in terms of temperament that doesn't work. Where in Flusser you have a very strong drawing on a phenomenological tradition, you're not going to find the same in Kittler. And last but not least, you have still a political project. Think of the photography book in Flusser, which to this way you are not going to find in Kittler. I think that there are connections there which need to be talked about, but at the moment I still know of very, very few serious attempts to think the two together. So I'm looking forward to your work.
Thank you, Geoff. That was extraordinary.
I was quoting you, so.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I wonder what you would have to say about the very, very well-known and often mentioned fact that German media theory, 6 parentheses please, is for 80 to 90% a child that was born in the seminar halls of literature studies. And although there are some, like Cornelia Fissmann, come from legal studies, and some others, but the major part, of course, as we all know. So, and I wonder what the situation here in this country is, and whether, if it's comparable, and with regard to this observer construct that you very convincingly was talking about. So what are the chances for this observer construct? Taking into account maybe the identical or analogous or non-analogous situations of the places and institutions where these crisscross observations take place. Of course, one could also very, very long speak about the reasons why. What was it that literary studies, and especially Germanistic, it wasn't so much English studies or French studies, although there were some, but I think in English studies in Germany, there was nothing. I mean, So what were the problem? What was the problem of German studies, and not the problem of English studies? What was the problem that German studies had and that English studies did not have? Of course, there are answers at hand, and the so-called crisis of the Germanistic, and so on and so on and so on. But does this suffice to answer this question?
So let me get this straight. You're asking the only Canadian here to give a description of the American situation.
Who else?
In order to give an answer which somehow frames the real answer that should be given, let's just quickly recap some well-known points. Number one, now for those who are interested in this matters, the very nice essay by Erhard Schüttpelz, Carry the Message Through, Bring the Message Through, is available in English, which is a very good analysis of the reasons why McLuhan was there. It was the conceptualization, it was the ability to think in hermeneutical grounds and to then, using ideas that came from new criticism, looking at the textual material that could then be transferred onto the analysis of other media carriers. So one, there was an expertise in place in a different discipline which was then transferred. Das ist trivial. The next thing, not quite as trivial, is that was precisely not being done in what was then not yet called Medientheorie. So there was an opening, a huge, white, uncharted territory into which people could flow in. Number three, the crisis you mentioned. Now, the interesting thing becomes the question you asked, how does this transfer onto the North American model? To give a very brief summary statement, I've written this in a paper called, I forget my own titles, Krautrock, Heidegger, Boogeyman, on the American reception of Kittler. Number one, for reasons which I will not go into because there's so many Germanists present here, and I could only do so by insulting Germanists, German studies failed in the reception of Kittler, which was a necessary sacrifice we had to pay to get out from German hegemony. This means that the principal first large-scale reception operations were carried out in the very large American and English departments where you have a surplus of modernists. These now, exactly like in Germany, moved across into, if you look at the equivalent of Medienwissenschaften, it is primarily staffed by people who are coming from outside of old-style communication studies. So you have, interesting enough, an analogous cross-disciplinary movement which takes place with the part of Kittler. Once again, both movements take place against a great white spot within communication studies that could only be filled by people who sit down and wonder, to take up David's talk from yesterday, how does the Botengang actually operate? Because all the other people are just focusing on the Botschaft. So these two things are necessary, and in many ways this is necessarily after Kittler. Whether his Greek work will make it, we can talk about that in private.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk.